Hello, room 22. This is part 3 of Abe Lincoln at Last, the Magic Treehouse book. Sorry, it's been about a week since I read, I think, at least. Let me catch up with what happened so far. Jack and Annie are trying to free a penguin from a spell. This penguin is named Penny, I guess, and she was frozen like stone. And let's see, she's Merlin's penguin, I guess, maybe a pet or something. So Jack and Annie are on a series of missions, 4 missions to free Penny from this spell. And let me see what they need to get. The third thing to break the spell is a single feather from a hero's hand. Use it wisely to give him hope. The hope he needs to heal his land. So that hero is going to be Abe Lincoln, I think, and they're going to give him hope to heal the land during the Civil War, because America was not agreeing with, the states were not agreeing with each other, and Abraham Lincoln was fighting against slavery. I'm going to go let Dexter out real quick. All right, remember that they needed to take this bottle of potion with them. There was a little blue bottle, had some directions on it that said, take a sip, make a wish for one thing to help you on your mission. Remember, trust the magic. And as we saw so far, Jack and Annie had met, they had gone to Washington, D.C., and they landed in a tree near the White House. And they met a couple of boys, an older brother named Willie and a younger brother named Tad, and those boys took them into the White House. And Tad was kind of a naughty kid, but Jack's following him because he had promised to take him to the president. Anyway, he let him, Tad let Jack into this bedroom, and they hid him under the bed, and somebody came out, sat down on the bed and put on some shoes, and when the person got up, Tad ran out and tackled the person, and I believe that is the last thing we saw. Oh, last thing we saw is that Jack realized that the person that Tad had tackled was the President of the United States. So here we go. Jack was horrified. Would the Secret Service arrest him along with Tad? Jack had to stop him. Suddenly, the President burst out laughing. He wrapped his hands around Tad's fist. "You little tadpole," he said. "You didn't scare me one bit." Then he started to tickle Tad. "Pa, don't, Pa, don't." Tad screamed and giggled and kicked. Pa? Pa? Jack thought. Abraham Lincoln is Tad's pa? Kids, sorry there's a loud noise. That's a street sweeper going by in front of my house. The President laughed. He stopped tickling Tad and kissed the top of his head. "What are you doing in here, my boy?" he said. "Pa, me and Willie found a treehouse," said Tad. "Did you know there was a treehouse here? 2 kids were in it, Jack and Annie. Jack said it belonged to them. I told him it was mine because it's in our yard. Isn't it mine, Pa?" Jack wanted to shout, "No, it's ours," but he was afraid to be caught under the bed. "Wait, what did you say their names were?" the President asked, sounding serious. "Jack and Annie?" "Yes," said Tad. "They came out of nowhere. Don't you think the treehouse is mine, Pa? Mine and Willie's?" "They came out of nowhere," said the President. "And their names are Jack and Annie? Are you sure?" "Why doesn't Tad tell him I'm right here under the bed?" Jack wondered. "Should I just crawl out?" "Yes, Pa, Jack and Annie," said Tad. "But I want to know about the treehouse." The doors opened. "Mr. President, you must come at once," a man said briskly. "You are late for your first meeting." "Sorry, Mr. Nikolai," President Lincoln said. "I'll be right there." He stood up. "The crowd is growing restless, sir," Mr. Nikolai said. "Before you know it, they'll storm your bedroom." "Oh, they wouldn't dare," said the President, chuckling. "Not with my bodyguard here." He ruffled Tad's hair. He's joking that Tad would tackle anybody that tried to come into his bedroom. Come along, tadpole. Escort me to my new office down the hall." "But when will you come and see the treehouse, Pa?" Tad said as they started out the door. "Perhaps when I take my horseback ride later," the President said. "I'd like to meet this Jack and Annie." The door closed and the room was quiet. Tad forgot about me, Jack thought. He couldn't believe it. Then he realized he'd better get out of the president's bedroom. He started to crawl out from under the bed, but the door opened again, so he quickly crawled back. "Dust first?" Jack heard a girl say. "Aye, then shake out the pillows and change the linens," which means change the sheets, said another. Jack could only see the black stockings and shoes of two maids as they bustled around the room. Now, he thought, before they make the bed. He scrambled out and ran to the door. One of the girls screamed. Jack didn't look back. He threw open the door and headed for the stairs. As he bounded down the steps, one of the maids shrieked. There was a boy under the bed. Jack reached the bottom of the stairs and squeezed through the crowd until he found a nook off of the hallway. He scrunched against the wall and then peeked around the corner to see if anybody was coming after him. Someone grabbed his arm. "Ah!" Jack yelled. "It's me," said Annie. "Where have you been? I've been looking all over for you." "I was upstairs, in President Lincoln's bedroom," Jack said. "Tad made me go in there. Did you know that President Lincoln is Tad and Willie's dad?" "That's what I was going to tell you. Willie introduced me to their mom," said Annie. "She was really nice. Those were all her relatives in the parlor." "Well, Tad tricked me into hiding under the bed, and I almost got caught," Jack said. "And Tad didn't even remember I was there. He kept talking about the treehouse, saying it was his." "Willie says Tad gets overly excited," said Annie. "He can't help it. Plus, it's their very first week in the White House." "Well, it was awful," said Jack. "I was trapped under the president's bed." Annie giggled. "You know, that's actually pretty funny," she said. "Not really," said Jack. "Don't worry," said Annie. "Willie would have saved you. He told me to find you and then come upstairs to his dad's office, and he'll introduce us. It's on the second floor at the end of the hall." "Okay," said Jack, sighing. "I heard the president say he'd like to meet us." "Really?" said Annie. "Yep, when Tad told him about the treehouse and you and me, the president kept saying, 'Jack and Annie? Jack and Annie? Are you sure their names were Jack and Annie?'" "That's weird," said Annie, "but I'm glad he wants to meet us. Come on." Jack and Annie headed down the hallway and up the stairs. On the second floor, Jack kept his head down just in case the maids were looking for him. Jack followed Annie down the hall toward a group of people standing outside a door. A skinny man with a small pointed beard was speaking to them. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, I'm sorry, but only the names on my list can meet with the president today." Jack recognized the man's voice. "That's Mr. Nikolai," he told Annie. "Who are you to tell us we can't see the president?" a woman in a pink bonnet asked Mr. Nikolai. "I am President Lincoln's secretary, ma'am," Mr. Nikolai said sourly, "and if you do not have an appointment, you must leave." "Excuse me, Mr. Nikolai, but I believe that I am on your list," said a dignified man. He showed the secretary a piece of paper. The secretary checked the paper against his list. "Of course. This way, Mr. Bennett," Mr. Nikolai said. He opened the door and nodded for Mr. Bennett to enter, then followed him inside. While the door was open, Jack and Annie peeked into the room. Abraham Lincoln was sitting at a long table. Tad was perched on his lap. So Tad's sitting on his lap during an important meeting. Fiddling with his dad's tie. So Tad's sitting there playing with President Lincoln's tie. Willie was studying a map on the wall, while the president was listening to one of the men at the table. "Willie," Annie whispered loudly. Let me show you the picture, kids. President Lincoln and his son, all these guys having a meeting. I don't know why I moved the book around. Here we go. Willie didn't hear, but Mr. Nikolai did. He rushed back out of the president's office. "Willie!" Annie shouted. Willie turned around just as Mr. Nikolai closed the door. "Excuse me, young lady," Mr. Nikolai said. "This is not a time for play." "I'm not playing, sir," said Annie as she and Jack stood at the front of the crowd. "We're friends of Tad and Willie's. And Willie just told us to come here to the president's office. He wants to introduce us to his dad." Mr. Nikolai scowled. "I'm afraid Mr. Willie misspoke. The president does not have time to meet you now," he said. "He is in a private meeting with the delegates from California, Indiana, and Maine." "Maybe later then?" said Annie. "Not maybe later," said Mr. Nikolai. "After this meeting, he is scheduled to have a meeting with his generals, and then a meeting with the Department of the Navy." "Excuse me," a man in the crowd called out. "But I heard the president say he'd like to meet us," Jack broke in. "I can't imagine why he'd say that," said Mr. Nikolai, shaking his head. "Following all the meetings I just listed, President Lincoln will meet with foreign diplomats, then with a group of senators, and then with reporters from the New York Times." "Mr. Nikolai, listen to me," someone shouted. "So, sir," Annie interrupted, "you're saying he'll have no free time at all today?" "Oh, he might have a free moment," said Mr. Nikolai. But should that miracle occur, the president will go for a horseback ride in the country and have a private meeting with himself. So he's saying he's not going to have time for Jack and Annie. This is Mr. Nikolai talking to them. He doesn't look happy. Got it, said Annie. She took a deep breath. Well, maybe you can just answer one question for us. Do you know if the president collects feathers? Mr. Nikolai threw up his hands. This is no time for silly questions, he said. Our country is divided, young lady. We are on the brink of war. What do you mean, sir? One of the men in the crowd shouted. What's the news from Fort Sumter? Yes, what do you know that we don't know? A lady called. Everyone started shouting at once. That's it. Leave now, everyone, Mr. Nikolai said. The president is busy. He works night and day for you and for the unity of this nation. As the crowd shouted back at the secretary, Jack tugged on Annie's sleeve. Let's get out of here, he said. We should wait for Willie, said Annie. I don't think Willie can help us, said Jack. Come on, let's go back to the treehouse and look at our research book. Maybe we can think of something else. Okay, said Annie, sighing. She and Jack hurried along the hallway, then down the stairs to the first door. They wove through the crowd, then escaped out the main door. Phew, that place is nuts, said Jack as they walked between the tall white columns of the White House. Are you sure we shouldn't wait for Willie, said Annie. I'm sure, said Jack. He hurried down the carriageway. Remember, they didn't have a driveway then for cars because there were no cars. Just carriages pulled up to the White House all the time, being pulled by horses. Even if, he's saying, I'm sure we shouldn't wait for Willie. Even if Willie took us back to the office to meet his dad, we wouldn't be alone with the president. Lots of other people would be there too. We couldn't ask him for a feather, and we sure couldn't give him any hope. Everyone would laugh. You're right, said Annie. Jack shook his head. How can the president even think in that place, with Tad jumping on him, his relatives visiting, his secretary yelling, and 1,000 people scheduled to meet with him, said Annie, and another 1,000 who are trying to meet with him, said Jack. They had arrived back at the treehouse. Phew, no wonder the president needs to take a ride in the countryside by himself, Jack said. He grabbed the sides of the ladder. Let's go up and look at the book. Wait, said Annie, I have a good idea. What? Asked Jack. Right now we really need to have our own meeting with Abraham Lincoln alone, said Annie, right? Yeah, so, said Jack. So if that's the one thing we need, our book can't really help, said Annie, but I know something that can. What? Said Jack. Annie reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out the bottle and read the label aloud. Take a sip. Make a wish for one thing to help you on your mission. Remember, trust the magic. So Annie's saying, hey, maybe this potion will let us meet with the president. Annie looked up at Jack. So why don't we make a wish to have a private meeting with Abraham Lincoln? Isn't it too soon to use our only magic, said Jack. Maybe, but maybe it's the perfect time, said Annie. So we wish to have a meeting with the president all by ourselves, said Jack. Yep, said Annie. Jack couldn't think of another plan. Well, okay, he said, let's do it. Just remember, we have to trust the magic, said Annie. Jack nodded. Annie took the top off the bottle. She raised the bottle to her lips and then swallowed a quick sip of the potion. She handed the bottle to Jack, and he did the same thing. You can make our wish, said Annie. Jack squeezed his eyes shut. We wish to have a meeting with Abraham Lincoln, he said, alone. There was a deafening whoosh and a roar. The earth shook like a speeding train passing by. Simile. The ground opened, and Jack felt as if he were falling through space, through a tunnel, down through blackness, into a world of daylight. Here's a cool picture of Jack and Annie after they drank the potion. And that is where I'm going to stop today. Hopefully it won't be another week and a half before I pick up with part 4. The story's just getting good. All right, kids, have a good one. Stay safe.